Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Kelsey Foran, and I'm an assistant director at the Atlantic Council Global Energy Center, and I'll be moderating today's discussion on the role of nature-based climate solutions in addressing the global climate challenge. I want to start by thanking the American Conservation Coalition for their partnership in this event and run through a few housekeeping notes before we get started. So this event is on the record. We're live streaming to Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube, and we encourage you to interact with us online about the event using the hashtag ACEnergy and tagging us at AC Global Energy. Those participating by Zoom may submit questions directly in your Q&A portal located at the bottom of your Zoom screen at any time during the event. And as we all know at this point in virtual Zoom life, an hour goes very quickly, but we'll try to get to as many as we can. So we're very excited to host this conversation with our panelists today that bring a variety of perspectives from their work in various sectors with natural climate potential. From forests to farmlands to coastal areas, there's a range of opportunities for natural solutions that could prove instrumental to addressing the climate challenge. Our panel of experts today will discuss the unique opportunities for and challenges to significant emission abatement in their respective areas of expertise, offering valuable insights into the viability of nature-based solutions and what leveraging natural infrastructure at the scale necessary could look like. So our event today is part of the Atlantic Council Raising Ambition series, which focuses on the higher climate ambitions that the Biden-Harris administration hopes to realize both at home and abroad. It will evaluate key technologies critical to helping reach these goals, emphasize sectoral approaches to decarbonization, and highlight what countries are increasing their commitments to climate action. So the aim is to build momentum in advance of this week's Leaders Climate Summit and encourage increased ambition from public and private sector actors. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Chris Bernard, Policy Director of the American Conservation Coalition, to provide opening remarks and an overview of today's discussion. Chris?
Thank you, Kelsey, and good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be here with you today. I'm especially excited to hear from our incredible panel, who, as Kelsey said, represents some very important and unique voices in the broader climate conversation. Because often when we talk about tackling climate change, the debate gets reduced to renewable energy versus fossil fuels, electric cars versus gasoline cars, or energy efficiency versus energy waste. And while these are certainly crucial aspects of reducing our carbon emissions, which is the ultimate goal when it comes to stopping a problem like climate change, we cannot overlook another strategy for significant emissions abatement: natural climate solutions, where energy solutions help us reduce the emissions we release into the atmosphere. Nature can help us remove existing emissions directly from the atmosphere, a process called natural carbon sequestration. We hear a lot about carbon capture technology, but in many ways, nature is the original carbon capture machine, pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere and storing it in trees, oceans, soils, and many other natural resources. As such, this concept of nature-based climate solutions refers to the enormous potential of natural landscapes to directly remove our carbon emissions from the atmosphere, and the practices we can implement to harness this unique capability. Currently, more than a quarter of global emissions come from forestry, agriculture, and land use changes. Yet, according to a report published by the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, nature-based solutions can actually account for 37% of all emissions reductions required by 2030, as called for by the IPCC. So clearly, this is an aspect of tackling climate change that we can't afford to ignore. And so there are several reasons why the organization I work for as policy director, the American Conservation Coalition, is working to emphasize and promote the enormous potential of these natural climate solutions. And in fact, next week we will be releasing officially a report on this called From Tree to Shining Sea: The Enormous Potential of Natural Climate Change Solutions, which is also the basis of this discussion we're having today with the Atlantic Council and our panelists. And Kelsey and I will make sure that we let you know via email or some other way when the report is live. But for now, I'll just outline the top 3 reasons for loving natural climate solutions before passing it off to Kelsey again to introduce the panel. Firstly, natural solutions are very efficient and cost-effective. As I said, they can account for over 1/3 of necessary emissions reductions, and sometimes as cheap as $10 per ton of carbon dioxide, which is much cheaper than any technology we currently have. Secondly, natural climate change solutions attract broad bipartisan support. Over 90% of Americans support planting more trees to tackle climate change, as just one example. And many of the bills being introduced in Congress right now have support from politicians across the aisle. From green urban spaces to agriculture to coastal communities to densely forested areas, natural climate solutions truly have a place for everyone across society and across the country. And thirdly, the benefits of natural climate solutions are extremely widespread. They don't just pertain to reducing carbon emissions, but they also can reduce erosion in coastal areas, make our crops more resilient, mitigate the risks of flooding, reduce wildfires through better forest management, et cetera, et cetera. And on top of this, studies show that implementing these nature-based solutions provides enormous economic opportunity for rural communities, at the same time as improving the psychological well-being of people that then live in healthier environments. So these are just some of the few reasons why what my organization works so much on natural climate solutions, and why this panel is so important for us to have as part of the broader climate conversation. But anyway, I'll pass it over back to Kelsey to introduce our amazing panelists, because at the end of the day, that's who we're all here to listen to.
Thanks so much, Chris, and what a great launching point to go off of here. So in turning to our virtual panel, it's my pleasure to introduce our four panelists who have so kindly agreed to spend the next hour with us. Jesse Ritter is the Director of Water Resources and Coastal Policy for the National Wildlife Federation. Daniel Atkins is a forester and owner of a forestry consultancy, Land and Ladies. Eve Boyce is the land project manager at the Open Space Institute. And Casey Cox is a sixth-generation Georgia farmer who owns and operates Longleaf Ridge Farms. Thanks so much to all four of you for being here with us, and let's get right into it. I think, Danielle, I'm going to start with you. So from a forestry perspective, what's the role of restoration and reforestation in meeting the climate challenge? And as it currently stands, what are the primary constraints and challenges to large-scale restoration and reforestation efforts?
All right. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me as part of this panelist group. It looks like an amazing group, and I look forward to hearing what everyone else is also going to say. So to address your first question, I also would like to say I'm going to be talking about forestry and reforestation as it focuses on the Southeast. That is where I'm based, and if you know anything or a little bit about forestry, forest management can change pretty significantly depending on which region you're in. So Southeast is different than the Northeast, which is different than the Western type of forest management, what's common. So I might touch briefly on those areas, but a lot of what I will be talking about from my experience will focus on what is common down here in the Southeastern region. So what is the role of restoration and reforestation? So trees obviously can play a huge role in the climate challenge and the climate opportunities, because trees, as most people know, absorb carbon, but they can only really truly be effective when it's also paired with active forest management. So letting trees just out there, and kind of go and be natural and let them do their thing because you think they're going to continue absorbing carbon isn't necessarily the answer, as you can see from a lot of increased wildfires, forest health issues, pretty common more so in the western areas. So how is reforestation an answer for climate opportunities with active management? So you also need to consider harvesting opportunities with your forestry. So you need to increase or at least have a sustainable harvest management plan, and therefore you have your reforestation plan immediately after. They have to go hand in hand. If you don't have a reforestation plan along with your clear cutting, or any type of harvest, whether you're doing shelter wood or a different type of cutting mechanism, then it's not truly forestry, and you're probably looking at a conversion opportunities. Because I've had a lot of folks talk to me and be like, well, they're cutting down those trees and they don't actually replant. They're not helping the environment, they're damaging it. And that's not necessarily the case, because oftentimes there's a 1-year time frame as well from when a clear cut is finished to when you'll actually start seeing the reforestation efforts begin. And that's simply just to let the land lie, kind of let things naturally come back, make sure there's not too much erosion. But I did want to emphasize that you have to have a reforestation plan with your harvesting. Otherwise, it's not actually forestry, and you're probably looking at development issues. So your second part of your question was constraints and challenges to large-scale restoration and reforestation. And in the Southeast, your biggest challenge is probably the fact that the majority of forest land is owned by private landowners. So in Georgia, 90% is private landowners, and that includes your industry as well as your small to medium landowner. And that includes folks that own just 10 acres type of homestead to folks that own thousands of acres. And looking at the average size, at least in Georgia, I know like about 50% own 50 acres or less. So you have a huge population of people that own the forest land doing their active management. And so trying to help encourage all of those to continue keeping their forest lands in forest. So that's one challenge you can probably consider. And the other southeastern states, the stats are slightly different, but they're pretty similar, where the majority of ownership actually does lie with the common average Joe, average Jane family forest that is, roughly 25 to maybe a couple hundred acres. Because I know a lot of folks often think it's all the forest lands, either national forest or private industry, and they don't actually think the average person has that much control over forest land and what's going out there. But that's not the case at all. In the Southeast, the private landowner does own the majority of the timberland out there. So that can be huge opportunities, but also a huge challenge. So I know we're going to get into some question and answers, so I don't want to give all my answers away right now.
Great, thanks so much, Danielle. And there's a lot to go back to from that, including primarily the balance between these harvesting efforts with conservation efforts. And hopefully we'll have time to dive into that. But speaking of forest conservation, I'm going to jump now to Eve Boyce. And Eve, thanks for being with us. What's the climate opportunity in forest conservation, and what are the primary current hurdles to large-scale conservation?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. I'm pleased to be here to talk about such an important topic. And I think I would start by saying that I think conserving our forests, as Danielle spoke about, is critically important, and it isn't necessarily an opportunity, but I think it's a requisite if we're going to meet our climate goals. As Danielle spoke about, forests have the potential to be a significant tool for sequestering carbon in our atmosphere, but they're also potentially a carbon source. And one of the reasons why forest conservation is so important is to prevent the release of carbon that we already have sequestered in our forests, in the trees, in the roots, in our soils. And I think it's about 13% of annual global emission today are caused by deforestation or forest destruction, while at the same time, globally, our forests absorb about a quarter of our carbon emissions each year. So right now we're benefiting from a really important carbon sink that helps us get closer to our emissions targets. But that isn't necessarily a given if we continue along the path of both deforestation and then also, as Danielle mentioned, mismanagement of our forests that can lead to changes in the sequestration rate. So I think when we're thinking about the opportunities in forest conservation, we're really thinking about two different components. The first is reducing the amount of carbon that's released each year due to deforestation or forest destruction, and therefore protecting the carbon that's stored in those forests currently. And then the second is protecting those forests so that they can continue to sequester carbon out of the atmosphere into the future. And hopefully there are management strategies that we can use to increase that rate as we move ahead. Scientists believe that halting the loss of forest ecosystems and restoring forests has the potential to contribute to over 1/3 of the total climate change mitigation that's required to meet the Paris objectives by 2030. So clearly, this is a critical component of any carbon mitigation strategy. And obviously, there's an added bonus of conserving forests, which is that forests are really important for biodiversity, for water filtration, for soil, and then in some parts of the globe, they're really important for human subsistence. In the United States, our forests store the equivalent of more than 33 years of US emissions, which is vast, but we also continue to lose nearly 1 million acres of forest to development each year. And we're seeing similar things globally. Tropical forests in the last year in tropical forests, deforestation increased by 12%. And this was even as we saw our global economy contract due to COVID. We're also seeing a lot of forests that aren't necessarily getting clear cut, but are getting damaged or becoming less resilient. And that's from unsustainable cutting, like Danielle spoke about, ineffective forest regeneration, invasion from pests, from wildfire. In the Western United States, we're seeing that a combination of forest fires and insect infestation and lack of management long-term has led to a number of forests that were once carbon sinks actually becoming carbon sources. And so given all this, there are a number of different strategies for actually doing forest conservation. You can create new protected areas. You can use a tool called a conservation easement. There's the sale of carbon offsets to corporations to fund conservation. And I'm happy to talk a bit more about each of those during the question and answer session if that's of interest. But I thought to start off, I would just flag some of the sort of issues or points of contention that come up when we're thinking about forest carbon conservation. And I won't go into these in detail, but I will raise them in case we want to discuss them further. So there's questions about land use. So for example, as our global population grows, are forests better used for other things like food production? Is using forest sequestration as an offset for another type of emission an issue of environmental justice? How do you address that issue, particularly around air pollution? And then also, how will future climatic conditions impact forest sequestration? So we're already seeing that happening in the West, where forests are going from becoming sinks to sources. And are we going to be able to continue to count on forest sequestration in the future as the planet warms? But I think generally the important message to start off with is forests are a huge gift to us when we're thinking about trying to decrease the amount of carbon in our atmosphere, but they are very much at risk. And so we have to think about conservation and protection as a critical strategy in any sort of climate mitigation scheme going forward. Great, and I will happy to talk about any more of this in the question and answer section.
Thank you, Eve. And I think we could spend the rest of the session covering all of the questions that forests bring up, but we're going to move to another natural resource, and that's our oceans and our water resources. Jesse Ritter is with us from the National Wildlife Federation. And Jesse, I wanted to kick us off with thinking about what our opportunity is with our oceans in particular. So we know that climate change is drastically impacting our oceans. We hear a lot about sea level rise and warming and salinity. But at the same time, the ocean presents ample opportunity for emissions reduction, and even by some estimates, more than 20% of the cuts needed to meet the Paris Agreement targets. So how can we leverage this natural infrastructure to protect our coastlines and water resources? And furthermore, what is the climate potential in such an approach?
Well, thank you so much, Kelsey, for the great question. And thanks to the Atlantic Council and American Conservation Coalition for having me today. It's great to be here with you all. A little bit more just by way of background on me and my work at National Wildlife Federation. A lot of what we're actually focused on is trying to advance both policies and funding to get more natural infrastructure implemented across sectors, across federal agencies. Another major emphasis area for us is work on large-scale ecosystem restoration. And some of the most incredible opportunities we have near term to restore ecosystems at scale for their many benefits, including climate adaptation and resilience, as well as carbon sequestration, are along our coastlines. So to get to your question, when I'm talking about natural infrastructure or nature-based carbon solutions around our coastlines, the features that are most prominently considered and mentioned include things like saltwater marsh, mangroves, healthy seagrass beds, natural dune systems, coral reefs, oyster reefs, etc. Not all of those features I just named are themselves carbon sinks necessarily, though many of them are. But all of them actually have a really important role in resilience for coastal communities. And to the first part of your question, Kelsey, how natural infrastructure can protect our coastlines. We at National Wildlife Federation really wanted to dig into this question more. We work with policymakers and communities all the time where we hear people say, you know, we hear that these features can provide meaningful protection, but we're just not sure, we don't trust them. They default to using the more traditional, you know, kind of levees, seawalls, concrete approaches to shoring up their, you know, climate resilience. So we took a step back last year. We really dug deep into the existing research and case studies to try to assess sort of the state of the science on natural defenses, natural infrastructure for resilience. And what we found was unequivocally that these types of features do provide significant and measurable risk reduction benefits for communities. They're often incredibly cost effective in the process of doing so. And that's actually something that was mentioned at the top in Chris's introduction. The ways that they do this are, there's a multitude of ways. There's obviously the ability of some of these types of features like wetlands to actually store floodwaters and absorb them on site. We also see that many of these features actually function to sort of serve as a speed bump. They attenuate wave energy for incoming storms, things like hurricanes or tropical storms, dampening that energy before it can actually hit and impact the coastal communities behind it. One review that we feature in a report that I'll mention in a moment looked at field-based studies from all over the world and found that natural coastal habitats can reduce wave heights by 35 to 71%, depending on the feature, which, as you can imagine, that makes a big difference for the communities and for the assets, the infrastructure and industries that might be behind those features. So, there's no question that when it comes to some of these natural infrastructure elements on our coastlines, there's a huge climate resilience benefit. If you're interested in hearing more about that, I encourage you to check out a report we put out called The Protective Value of Nature. It's on our website, or follow up with me and I'll share a copy. But to the second part of your question, Kelsey, which is really kind of about not just the risk reduction benefits of these features, but the climate mitigation benefits of these features. The other speakers have already done a great job of kind of emphasizing that natural climate solutions are a significant tool in our toolbox when it comes to confronting climate change. In the case of our coastal and marine systems, we often refer to these features as blue carbon. And some of the most impactful, let's say, or effective forms of blue carbon systems are things like mangroves, seagrass, kelp forests, and salt marsh. So that's oftentimes what folks are talking about when we're talking about blue carbon. The potential of these systems to sequester and store carbon is really phenomenal. Some studies actually suggest that they can store as much as 10 times more carbon per unit area than forests, terrestrial forest systems, depending on the feature. So it's, even though that they are smaller overall in terms of surface area potentially on the planet, the potential sequestration benefits are huge. Part of the reason for that is that these features are not only storing carbon sort of in the actual vegetation and the leaves and the stems, but actually very much in their soils as well. And because by nature, these features are actually wet, that means that the soil environments are low oxygen, decomposition is happening more slowly, and we're able to kind of capture and keep that carbon locked up for centuries or even millennia if it goes undisturbed. So, the flip side of this, which Eve did a great job articulating in her remarks, is that there's also a lot of carbon that we can be releasing if we are disturbing these habitats. So both, with that incredible potential also comes the incredible potential for additional emissions if we're not thoughtful about controlling development and protecting these intact ecosystems where we still have them. Just one final point I'll make in the opening remark here is just that, we talked a lot about the co-benefits, so to speak, or the other ancillary benefits of these features for communities. A few others that I'll mention besides, of course, hazard risk reduction, there's the recreational opportunities and the support for additional industries. Along our coastlines, a lot of these features also double as critical nursery habitat for our fisheries industries. They support, really robust tourism and ecotourism opportunities along our coastlines, and they also can serve to help improve the quality of our drinking water. So, the benefits are plentiful, even though natural climate solutions alone maybe isn't the silver bullet to solving the climate crisis. We're leaving a lot on the table if we don't really think of these as one of the first tools that we ought to be deploying at scale as much as we can. So thanks, Kelsey.
Thanks a lot, Jesse. And now we'll switch gears again and move to agriculture. Casey, as a farmer, firsthand that a changing climate presents risks for the agricultural sector. So in what ways can the sector be part of the solution, and what do we really mean by sustainable agriculture?
Hey, Kelsey, thank you so much for the opportunity to be part of this panel with these other incredible panelists today. This is a topic that is really important to me and really close to my heart because, as you know, our farmers depend on natural resources, and the changing climate could have tremendous impacts on our livelihood and our future, not just for my generation, but for many generations beyond now. So I appreciate the opportunity to be part of this. Just to give everyone some background and perspective on what we grow on our farm here in Southwest Georgia. We grow sweet corn as our main crop, the vegetable, and we also grow peanuts and field corn and soybeans. And over half of our farm is actually in timber. So I've really enjoyed these discussions around forestry. We could probably talk about that all day as well. I'm really passionate about trees, and our farm is called Longleaf Ridge because we named it after a tree. So I'm definitely passionate about that as well. I've talked about conservation and sustainability and resilience for a long time, but in October of 2018, my perspective on all of those things was fundamentally changed. Because we had a devastating hurricane hit our community in Southwest Georgia then, and it hit us in South Georgia as a Category 3. It breached the coastline in Florida as a Category 5, and then it was still a Category 3 when it came over us. It was essentially like a 6-hour tornado. And I had always really looked at climate change through the lens of drought, because that was really the other issue we'd always had to deal with, but that just made me realize this is so much bigger than just drought, and this is something that is going to impact my future as a farmer. And coincidentally, around the same time that happened, somebody said to me, when Mother Nature is your business partner, you never quite know what to expect. So even though farmers across the country all have different views on this, or have different ways that they may be able to contribute to all of this, we all are dealing with Mother Nature as our business partner. One really interesting statistic to throw out there regarding ag's role, and especially rural America's role in this, is less than 20% of the US population lives in rural communities, but that covers about 97% of our land mass. And that comes from the US Census Bureau. And they also said that almost all of our nation's food and energy production occurs in rural landscapes. And so that's even though I'm spotlighting agriculture, I also want to spotlight the role of rural communities in addressing these issues, because it is so critical that we include them. And agriculture and rural communities go hand in hand, and it's really important that we find the balance between sustainability from an economic perspective and an environmental perspective. I feel the three things I always highlight that where agriculture can really play a role here, and three things that may not solve the problem but can certainly go a long way in addressing the challenges that we face, are conservation, innovation, and partnership. There's no silver bullet, but every segment of the ag industry has best management practices. We have conservation practices we can build on. There's always room for improvement, no matter what type of agriculture you're involved in or what type of farm you have. We have a great foundation to build on of conservation, and then we're learning something new every single day. And one thing, actually, before I came back to the farm, I worked for our local conservation district, which really opened my eyes to the advances in technology and efficiency that exist, and how many opportunities we have to really improve our operations on multiple levels. And I'm really passionate about that as it relates to water conservation, but there are just as many advances and opportunities when it comes to soil health and optimizing other input use as well. Also really passionate about precision agriculture. I think there's a tremendous amount of opportunity for us to implement precision agriculture and streamline our operations. And anytime we can increase efficiency, it's usually better from a resource use standpoint. We really have a lot of incredible research that's been done by universities all over the country. I can certainly speak to what University of Georgia, University of Florida have done here in the Southeast with new varieties and practices. Just to give an example, with peanuts, we're planting twice as much we're growing twice as much on the same amount of land as when my dad first started farming. And a lot of that comes down to better varieties, better practices, better technology, and that equates to better land use efficiency, which is really critical as we talk about all of this. And then I also mentioned partnerships, and that those are those public-private partnerships, and I know we're going to talk a little bit more about that, but sustainable agriculture is one of those things, kind of like sustainability in general. If you ask 10 people what it means, you'll get 10 different definitions, but there's a lot of opportunity for all of us in that, and it's a continual learning process, and it's just really important for agriculture and farmers to be at the table, and a very diverse set of agriculture to be at the table, because we are all so different in what we do.
Thanks, Casey, and thanks for all the panelists for their opening round of remarks. I think I want to build initially on this point of partnerships, and really think through what kind of partnerships are necessary to scale up the impact, the climate impact in each of your sectors. And maybe Jesse, I'd like to start with you, given a timely announcement this morning of a new coalition, the Blue Nature Alliance, that's targeting 7 ocean locations around the world for conservation efforts, with a particular focus on building relationships with national leaders and local communities. Is this the model that we need to insist upon, this kind of multi-layer partnership model, in order to fully manage our ocean resources effectively?
Well, that's an exciting announcement that I hadn't seen yet, so that's great news. And I think the short answer is yes. We need all players to be at the table if we're going to solve problems of this scale. I also think that these sorts of public-private and cross-sector partnerships is really where innovation often comes from. It's also how we leverage dollars, because we know that the needs here are far greater than the money that any one public institution is really going to have to bring to the table. So we do a lot of creative work at NWF with partners in the insurance industry, for example, who kind of share our investment in wanting to reduce risk. They're not necessarily looking at natural solutions for the climate mitigation benefits, though I think that they appreciate those, but for the risk reduction benefits, nevertheless, that's a great partnership, to move the ball forward. Similarly, there's something called the Natural Infrastructure Initiative that has brought together some major companies like Caterpillar, construction company, with some of our NGO partners, including the Nature Conservancy, to kind of work, arm in arm to advance good natural infrastructure policies, both, on the ground at the state level and through Congress. So just 2 small examples. Then there's these great, kind of global partnerships that are coming together. I think we need all hands on deck. And I think that that's the kind of forum where we can get some of our most creative thinking moving.
Great, and maybe I'll jump over to you, Casey. So the kind of building on this idea of partnerships, the transition to sustainable agricultural practices requires considerable amounts of capital and access to information at the outset. So how can agriculture prioritize kind of inclusivity and equity, given this need for substantial resources up front? Is this where partnerships really serve an important purpose in the agricultural sector?
Absolutely. There are, of course, really critical federal programs that are available that do that, but they can be a little bit burdensome, even for people who are well established and on their farms, and not beginning farmers. People who are familiar with the system can sometimes have trouble navigating that. So it's certainly a barrier for newer farmers or beginning farmers or small farmers to get started with that transition. But there's also great opportunity there, because I know that's something that USDA and other partners are really trying to increase that access and remove those barriers. So there's a lot of opportunity for outreach and education right now. But I think it's also important that there is additional science and research to understand how to scale sustainable practices, and not just looking at the larger farms or the more traditional farms, but also seeing how we can implement conservation practices on a smaller scale. And then I think it's also really important to figure out ways where we could potentially reduce the red tape and the requirements that go into that, because I know that's also a huge barrier for some farmers. Time is precious commodity in agriculture, and spending hours trying to deal with paperwork and applications can sometimes make some of those cost share programs a little bit more difficult to access. So streamlining that process and maybe making the timing a little bit more convenient would be really helpful to include farmers of all scales and sizes, because some people who have participated in those programs know that you have to really be planning almost a year in advance for some type of conservation practice you want to implement. So helping with the planning and preparation and really holding hands through that process there's a whole suite of opportunities, but there just really needs to be, we really need to work with people who are already on the ground and working with those farmers and already have relationships within the community, and that grassroots support and the grassroots networks of education and outreach, I think, could really do a lot to reaching a diverse set of farmers at all different scales and helping them access those opportunities.
And what role does broadband access play in this? So the recently announced infrastructure plan, the American Jobs Plan, has a focus on providing universal broadband access to rural communities in the US. How might this approach to increased digital connectivity also promote the integration of these practices and the sharing of all of the good resources that you're talking about, and this growing body of research that's growing each and every day? How do we share these things and close the digital divide?
Well, I would love to have broadband, especially in this era of virtual living that we're in. If it were raining today, I may not be able to join you on this panel. So I think that honestly, talking about the different scales of sustainable practices and all of the technology that it could be available to us, we are so limited into what we can implement because we do not have reliable connectivity or widespread connectivity. So I've heard people saying for years about broadband expansion, and we started to put a tower up on our farm 20 years ago, and we were thinking, oh no, the technology will catch up. We'll have high-speed internet really soon. There's no reason to put a tower on our farm. And here we are 20 years later, and we still don't have reliable access. So I think that we need to think outside the box. I know that some infrastructure, some specific types of infrastructure related to broadband can be really expensive and maybe aren't the right method. Thinking like fiber optic cables all across these rural landscapes may not be as realistic as the low orbital satellites that are kind of being tested right now. So trying to figure out what would actually work and be most cost effective. But this is a key part of the puzzle that absolutely has to be, that really needs to be fixed before we can make more progress.
Great, thank you. And I'll circle back now to Danielle and Eve. So what do partnerships look like in forestry and in your kind of respective areas of expertise? And maybe Eve, I'll start with you.
Sure. Yeah, I think partnership is critical when you're thinking about the conservation of forest land. The biggest challenge for us, I think, in terms of conservation in the United States is finding capital to do the work. So there's still no shortage of land to be conserved. And as Danielle spoke about in her opening remarks, a lot of that land is privately owned. A lot of it's owned by small families or individuals. And so the amount of capital that's needed to ensure that that land is protected in the long term and not developed or turned into something else, is immense. And partnerships play a really important role in figuring out or in pulling in capital that we can use for conservation. So one example of that would be the voluntary carbon markets that have been put in place across the United States. There's various different voluntary markets that corporations can buy into. There's also a market in California that's a compliance marketplace that's been in place for several years. And that's one way that private money can be pulled into this land conservation practice, but it's really challenging. And I think the more that we can partner with capital sources outside of specifically the land conservation realm, the better as we try to address these issues.
And Danielle, any thoughts?
Sure. And again, I'm kind of like the offset balance of what Evie's talking about. She talks about the conservation of forest lands, and my emphasis is going to be the management of the forest lands we already have. So partnerships obviously play a huge role. So for example, my company, Land and Ladies, has a huge partnership opportunity because I wouldn't be able to do what I do. And what is it that I do? Because I never actually explained that in my opening remarks, is I reach out and I educate and empower women to kind of take on their land management activities. So women, of course, are taking on more of those financial decisions. They're ultimately being the decision maker in the end because women tend to outlive men. So what my business does is I reach out to empower women to feel confident and gain the resources and foundations to be able to manage their property without feeling overwhelmed or being swindled by somebody else, or just deciding to sell it to somebody because that's the easiest decision, because maintaining that management is just too overwhelming. So with that, I have a whirlwind of partnerships, from universities to the industry, to various other organizations like hunting leases, and they all kind of partner with the efforts I'm doing to reach this audience and demographic and encourage and empower them to continue maintaining their forest lands and managing it with sustainable forestry. And so without everyone kind of working together, and you have 20,000 different puzzle pieces kind of just doing whatever they want to do with their property, whether it's leaving it natural, some maybe are managing it very intensely. The more we can all work together to continue sustainable forest management, continue the industry, equals healthier forests, equals more forests are going to stay forests rather than get converted to development or other means that are just easier to handle. And so there's a lot of opportunities of partnerships, and how it looks is going to vary. But from what I do in my experiences, it's really invaluable just to get the landowner base to continue actively manage it, or getting them to start actively managing it for healthy, sustainable forests.
Thanks, all. And I want to remind everybody in the audience that you can submit your questions through a Q&A portal. We already have many good ones coming through, and I have many more questions I want to ask. So where to begin here? I think I want to circle back around to a point that Casey made about this 97%, I believe, of our landmass being in rural areas. And going off of a question from the audience, there must be a lot of pressure to develop these lands, especially in the wake of an increasing need for renewable power sources, or generally power production, especially with wind and solar. And that often has large land use needs. So how do we balance the need to preserve forest and ocean ecosystems with this increased desire to develop? And does anyone want to jump in first here? Danielle, sure, go for it.
So the first thing I'm going to say is markets. Markets are critically important in being able to maintain and incentivize the average landowner to keep their trees, to continue the reforestation efforts. Because as I mentioned already, the average landowner owns, between 50 acres or less, or maybe a couple hundred acres. And so they're only getting income periodically, maybe every 10, 15, 25 years. And so without those strong markets, they're going to think, why should we bother putting these trees back into trees if it wasn't that economically viable for them. So keeping markets competitive, but also keeping tax incentives for forest lands low, because for the average family landowner, they're paying taxes on their property every year. And as I mentioned, they may not be getting periodic income like they may from farmers who have those annual crops. The average tree farmer is getting income maybe if they're doing some supplemental pine straw raking or other type of leases, but you're still looking at 10, 15, 20 years down the line before you're actually getting that. So keeping property taxes low and maintaining a strong market is really going to be able to help the average landowner keep trees in trees, and maybe even encourage new landowners to go into planting trees.
I'll tag in here as well. I think this is this question is getting at a really critical issue, which is that there are trade-offs involved here almost inevitably with a lot of these decisions that get made. We do a lot of work on offshore wind, and we care a lot about wildlife. And so there's this balancing act. How do we develop renewable energy responsibly in a way that's responsible for communities that are going to be impacted by those decisions and for wildlife and other animals? And so, I do think that we can do this thoughtfully, we can do it strategically. A lot of times that involves making sure that we have the best information and the best data. One of the outstanding needs in the blue carbon space, for example, is to really make sure we're inventorying where these existing blue carbon systems are that are storing the most carbon, but also where are the areas where we have the greatest restoration potential. We can't restore everything. We have limited resources. So how can we apply those resources in the most strategic way and to the greatest overall, net benefit? So I don't think there's a really simple answer. I think Danielle raises a lot of great points and great tools. But ultimately, in many cases, there's just trade-offs that have to be made when we're talking about, things like renewable siting.
Jesse, that's exactly right. You took the words out of my mouth, and the same applies for forest conservation. I would say there's still a need for more information on exactly where trees are sequestering the most carbon. And my experience is in the United States, but I think this is true globally, that forests really vary in terms of how efficient they are. And as I mentioned earlier on, some forests are actually carbon sources and some are carbon sinks. And so recognizing that we have a limited opportunity to do conservation on the ground and limited resources to invest, how do we make sure that we're investing those resources in the places where we get the most return on our investment in terms of carbon sequestration? And I think the science is still evolving there. We're still figuring that out.
Great, thank you. And we have a question from the audience about the role of carbon markets. And I know, Eve, you mentioned this at some point earlier on, and we didn't yet have a chance to build on it. So what do all of you think about the possibility of carbon markets to incentivize nature-based solutions? How can markets be designed to benefit foresters, farmers, ranchers, and not overly on the benefits nature-based solutions can provide? Maybe Eve, I'll start with you again because you brought this up before.
Sure, yeah, I just feel sort of conflicted about carbon markets. I think to some extent in the short term, they are an important tool for bringing capital, as I said, into the space that, particularly depending on what the price of carbon ultimately lands at, there's the potential that, as Danielle spoke about, it ends up being more lucrative for a landowner to retain their forests than to develop them. And in that case, in some sense, we're sort of out of our business model. We don't need to do conservation anymore. We don't need to be buying land because that would be the natural choice of a landowner. So in that sense, I think carbon markets are really important, but there are a lot of equity and environmental justice concerns that are raised by carbon offset regimes, and a lot of the efficacy of carbon markets really depends on how those regulations are written. And so it's a little bit hard to answer that question, because I think the answer really is that it depends on how the rule is written as to whether there are those environmental justice issues, and then whether it's really effective, whether those offsets are really legitimate.
I'll jump in because my answer was similar to Eve's. Hers was "it depends" and mine was "possibly." So I think that when it comes to carbon markets, if they're done correctly, it could really be an effective way to do this and to help incentivize landowners and farmers to do things that may not make the most sense economically. And just to give an example, I'll dip into my forestry passion here, but one of the things we have on our farm, I talked about longleaf pines earlier, and over half of our farm is in timber, and we do manage some of that commercially, but we also manage some of it ecologically. We really prioritize longleaf restoration and regeneration. And longleaf pines can live to be 300 or 400 years old, and they have a tremendous amount of biodiversity benefits that are really important to us. But from an economic perspective, that is probably the dumbest thing we could do, especially with hurricanes and tornadoes coming in. We're not really, we do thinning every now and then, and we actively manage our forests. We would make Danielle proud. But it really, from an actual economic perspective, we're not really doing the best thing. But thankfully, my parents and our family has always really prioritized that ecological value. But this is a scenario where a different family, or even our family, we would really benefit from a carbon market, because we do want to conserve, we do want to maintain that landscape and the biodiversity and the benefits that come from that. But we also are sacrificing from an economic perspective to do that, and we're very fortunate to be in a position where we can make that decision, but not every landowner is. So that's where I think carbon markets could potentially play a role in giving landowners another opportunity to maybe do restoration and regeneration in a bit of a different way. And I know that's really specific because it's about longleaf pine trees, but that's just something that it's kind of my perspective as someone who's really thought a lot about carbon markets and what that would look like for someone like us.
Jesse or Danielle, do you want to jump in?
Yep, that sounds good. So I'm kind of going to play on both Evie and Casey. So I know there's a few businesses out there that are actually playing with the carbon markets idea, from doing like 1-year contracts with landowners to those more traditional 30, 40 years. And so my answer is still, it depends. It depends on kind of what the focus is and how it's structured. Evie kind of touched base on, there's not a ton of science on like just the carbon market world, really, like what trees are better, older, younger. There's a lot of different type of misnomer science. Like there's not a clear answer on which one is better. And so my one concern would be is if it only focuses on old growth trees, then you're decentivizing, or you're incentivizing landowners to keep old growth trees, but you're decentivizing harvesting, which is an important management tool for reforestation. And the fact that there is a lot of literature going out there that carbon is stored in like wood products, so cross-laminated timbers as a growing market being pushed in the Southeast, is huge opportunity. So trying to balance carbon market opportunities for landowners without completely incentivizing harvesting and putting that black eye that a clear cut is deforestation, is the end of the world, because the deforestation word doesn't fit with clear cuts, because deforestation is only true if it's not being replanted ultimately. And a lot of times the average the average person instantly thinks of deforestation when they see a clear cut versus sustainable forestry. So in regards to carbon markets, I think there is a huge opportunity for landowners like Casey that do have ecological strong values that they're balancing with their economic parts of their property to be able to kind of maintain that balance, but just making sure that it's structured well enough and not decentivizing just harvesting in general.
Yeah, and I mean, a lot of what I would say has been said. I'll just add in, it's only been in the past several years, I guess 2015, and then some updates more recently, where we started to get, globally agreed upon methodologies for how to even count a lot of or develop the carbon capture projects or benefits at least in the blue carbon space in terms of tidal wetlands and seagrass restoration. So, I think that the challenge is just making sure that these things are quantifiable, and then of course making sure that they're sustainable. So we don't want, from a biodiversity perspective, for example, to have these policies resulting in major habitat conversion where we're displacing native species or disrupting, the native biodiversity because we're trying to grow more of some particular plant that, grows faster or stores more carbon or whatever. So there's those balancing factors. And then Eve's point just about making sure that we're not basically putting these markets in place at the expense of air quality and water quality elsewhere, or in communities that are already bearing a larger brunt of, kind of legacy pollution and other decisions that have been made over time.
Great, thank you. And like many of these topics, we could spend the entire session talking about carbon markets. We're getting close to time, but I want to ask one last question, and maybe we could hit all four of you quickly. What are some of the key emerging technologies, maybe one or two, that are leveraging the climate potential in your space? Maybe Danielle, I'll start with you. Thoughts on drone reforestation technology? Is it feasible? Is it scalable? What are your thoughts?
Luckily, my thoughts are pretty short because I'm not super familiar with it. I would just say that there's pros and cons to it. From the little bit that I do know, the opportunities for it is that there is a labor source for a lot of replanting and reforestation efforts. So obviously that would be a huge pro. You just have drones. The cons and challenges would be that overstocking, you don't really get to control your reforestation efforts. Most reforestation in the Southeast is done with seedlings, and obviously that's not going to be feasible with drones. So there are opportunities, but it depends on what end result you want, and ultimately what is the goal, and making sure there's a follow-up management plan for those overstocking scenarios, because otherwise you're just going to end up with a lot of Western scenarios, again, with intense wildfires, forest health diseases that come from overstocking.
Great, and Jesse, I'll come back to you now. Thoughts on the emerging technologies in the water resources space?
Sure, and I'm no expert on emerging technologies per se. I do know that developing additional pilots of these blue carbon ecosystems, in the coastal space, actually measuring their sequestration values and potential, that we still need to do more of that work, and that work is ongoing. One opportunity that I see is actually in the Gulf of Mexico, where we have a historic amount of restoration happening under the BP oil spill settlement. Really the largest ecosystem restoration effort by dollar amount in our country's history is unfolding there over a 15-year period. Tons of data are coming out of that, and the Gulf is already sort of the epicenter for a blue carbon opportunity in our country. And so I think just in general, looking to the lessons learned from what's happening in that space, and seeing if we could even layer in or leverage that restoration work to answer some of these outstanding research questions. I feel like that's one of the critical ongoing needs to really continue to advance the field of blue carbon.
Great, and Casey or Eve?
Yeah, I could talk about this all day, but I'll just keep it short and say that I think there's a tremendous amount of opportunity in the precision ag space, especially with sensors and remote control and monitoring and automation. Those are the things that I really love getting into on our farm, and I'm really excited to see where those continue to develop in the coming years.
I'll just be the Luddite in the group and just say, I think we have a lot of technologies now and know a lot about forest management that we're not implementing already. And so in the future, I'd love to see more forests being managed for forest health and complexity, because that's critically linked with sequestration. So, only 9% of the earth is in forests that aren't touched by humanity. So we're not going to find very many groves of old growth forest anymore. So it's critically important that we manage those properties and forests that we already have that are being impacted by lack of management or invasive species or pests, to ensure that they're resilient and continue to store carbon in the future.
Thanks, and we're somehow already at an hour. So thanks so much for joining us today for this timely and productive conversation. And thanks especially to our panelists and Chris for providing opening remarks, and for everybody taking the time to share their perspectives. I would also like to thank the American Conservation Coalition once again for their partnership in this event, as well as George Frampton, Maria Castillo, Lauren Holland, and Roger Morales on the Atlantic Council side for all of their hard work in making this engine run. So if you would like to rewatch the panel or share the stream with a colleague, you can find a recording on the Atlantic Council website and the YouTube channel. If you like what you saw this afternoon, stick around and join us in 30 minutes or so at 4 p.m. for Raising Ambitions, Moving the Needle on Energy and Environmental Justice. We also have a full day of programming tomorrow, so be sure to check out the Atlantic Council website to view the full agenda. Thanks again for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.